in his attempt to make the Supreme Court justices have their job, Trump really wants to get that employment up. He makes a bunch of executive orders that will keep the Supreme Court busy, as if as if they do not already have a lot of things to do. Specifically, the ones we'll talk about later are, of course, the recent executive order that prohibits flag burning. Now, that has been ruled constitutional already 2 times in the past, so we'll talk about the chances that this might have. Of course, something else that happened is he fired one of the members at the Fed. Now, that is also questionable when it comes to his authority as a president. So that might be another case. But the first thing we'll discuss is maybe not something that will be challenged by the Supreme Court, since it did happen in the past, but definitely something moving America in the more, fascist direction is the only way to really call it. The sort of control of businesses or corporation speaks exactly of that. And we are, of course, talking about the recent acquiring of 10% of Intel, a private or publicly traded company, technically. And of course, a statement by Kevin Hassett, the head of the National Economic Council, that we might see more of this. So we have a clip of that from his interview on MSNBC. So we'll also watch that. With that, welcome to the Daily Objective. Joining me today is James Valiant. And James, so I'll go to you. We have already discussed this Intel thing a little bit in the past on Saturday. But basically, for people who missed it, under Biden, there was the CHIPS Act, meaning to basically move, or the goal, I think, was to basically move some production of semiconductors into America. And the goal was to basically to provide a stimulus to certain companies that are dealing with that. So like Intel was has taken money from the CHIPS Act, or under the CHIPS Act. And with that, Trump just came in, basically, I believe that the money was sort of like still going, and Trump was considering, well, should they receive the rest of it since it was already appropriated? And he said, well, might use my power of a government to basically show a private company to do what I want. So what Intel did is basically they created, meaning if you own Intel, congratulations, you lost about 9% of the value of your stock, because basically around 10% more shares were basically created in order to give it to the government. Now these, just to clarify, are not controlling shares or not voting shares, so the American government doesn't technically have a sort of like the voting power or a voting block that they would normally have, but still they have 10% of a private company, which again has happened in the past. But with this one, in the past, it was sort of like a temporary measure, still bad, but now it seems more of a, might as well, if we can get percentage of a company. James, any thoughts on this?
Well, the CHIPS Act was basically an act that subsidized the microchip industry. Those semiconductors. Most semiconductors were being made. Most ordinary semiconductors were being made in Taiwan, and that was considered a national security risk. So, boy, we had to have a federal policy that subsidized domestic, integrated circuit manufacturers like Intel. Now that is economic fascism, just the subsidy. Just forget control. But government, and as Ayn Rand explained very eloquently, government should have no business in the economy. Capitalism is not government subsidizing, supporting, holding up business. Capitalism is government out of business altogether. If companies fail, they should just fail and go down. If there isn't a domestic market for something, there isn't a domestic market for something. It is no business of the government, none whatever, to say that we're going to encourage certain businesses, discourage certain businesses, regulate and control them. It's through the regulations that, of course, they really get effective control. That is the as opposed to the communist model, which seizes the means of production, what Mr. Mondame, the New York mayor candidate, advocates, and, say, government-owned grocery stores like Mr. Mondame advocates. It is this government getting in bed with government getting in bed with businesses that is the way that fascist governments of yore used to regulate the economy. The private company would still hold title, but the government would come in and basically tell them how to operate. And this is what most federal regulations kind of do, to the extent they come in and tell businesses how they have to do their business, what they have to do. And getting an ownership stake interest is exactly the kind, although these are not, as you pointed out, voting shares. Owning 10% of a company is to influence that company, and it will provide the foot in the door for regulation or control if they do something that the government doesn't like. After all, the government has to protect its interest. And the way these people justify it is, well, we should if we're going to bail out and protect and subsidize the chip manufacturers, then we should get some return on our investment. Well, that's not sufficient logic to own the company. You could do a loan. Now, I would say don't do the loan. Government should not be loaning, subsidizing, regulating business at all. But here, by having a public stake in Intel and by saying, oh, there could be more to come, what they're effectively doing is fusing government and the economy. Trump is an enemy of capitalism. Trump is not a free market advocate. He is not in any way, shape, or form. Now, I would also give a little history lesson here. It is not entirely unprecedented. However, it is a precedent. The precedents that go all the way back to the founding of America were controversial. Take the first bank of the United States. That was government, in effect, being involved in private banking, controlling private banking by controlling this company. There were other exceptions. For example, certain transportation companies, like I think it was the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company back in the around 1825, or the huge subsidies that were given to make the first transcontinental railroad. Or what was it, almost 70, 75 years ago now, Truman tried to using just presidential powers, tried to nationalize the entire steel industry, just using presidential powers. The Supreme Court knocked them back. When it came to the Bank of the United States, it was hugely controversial. Andrew Jackson got rid of it. Jefferson never liked it and let it lapse. These subsidies, these boondoggles to companies like canal companies or railroad companies were always controversial. Even in 2008, when we had the financial crisis at the end of George Bush's administration, too big to fail, they bailed out a bunch of Wall Street firms. And in the process of the 2008 economic crisis, the government again took certain ownership interest, and that was highly controversial. You know what George Bush actually said when that happened in 2008? I'm not an Ayn Rand. This is it. I'm not an Ayn Rand capitalist or an Ayn Rand free market person. He invoked Ayn Rand's name in saying we're going to bail out these big companies. No, those companies are not too big to fail. They ought to have failed. If the government created the situation in the first place, the government is responsible for that. It ought not to have created the situation in the first place. You don't need more government to correct what was a government-created crisis in the first place. And this is true, I think, also with the chip industry, by the way. If America is following a bad policy that, it's not a question of protecting it with tariffs either. It's all of our other regulations that make it impossible, right? For example, our labor laws, our minimum wage laws. If labor is cheaper in Taiwan, and that's the primary reason why Taiwan makes most ordinary integrated circuits and computer chips, then it's American domestic economic policy that is harming the domestic chip industry. It has nothing to do with tariffs or them taking advantage of us on tariffs. People say, oh, well, you're advocating slave labor, low-wage labor here in the United States. Well, no. I'm advocating a just price for labor, a free market price for labor. I'm not an exaggerated one done at with a gun put to our head by labor people saying this is the minimum required wage, or this is the enforced union bargaining that we have to engage in. So what we do is we increase through our labor regulations, through the welfare state, frankly, we increase the cost of employment. We give a competitive advantage to companies like Taiwan, right? and they take over the ordinary chip industry just like that. So what is happening is the classic thing that Ayn Rand long ago observed: economic controls lead to more economic controls, which lead to more economic controls. So if we have labor laws, welfare laws, minimum wage laws that artificially drive up the wages of American labor, we give a competitive advantage to foreign companies in making things that where cheaper labor can be used to make them. Once ordinary chips, for example, become a standardized thing, and you're just a factory worker, you're just a factory worker. And we put ourselves at competitive disadvantage to any company that uses that, quote, cheaper labor. Well, guess what? That's what the fair free market value of that labor is. But in any case, what Trump is doing is Trump is extending this economic fascism. He's increasing governments. He's layering on, just as Ayn Rand said, government solutions to government-created problems and moving our economy. Both parties are doing this, and Ayn Rand said this as well. America is moving in a fascist direction, and you can absolutely see this fascist convergence from both parties. You know,
Yeah, and to sort of build a bit more upon that, first, thank you, Bonnie, for a super chat, because somebody asked about what is the definition of fascism, and let's just cover it from the economic aspects, because we want to cover much more today, and we'll actually cover the social aspect as well in a bit. But I think in economy, I think Ayn Rand was right when she basically said that the difference between communism and fascism is almost cosmetic or is pretty much superficial. I think the main difference, if you do want to differentiate it in economics, is basically the goal of communists is complete government ownership, or sort of the public ownership, as they would say, of the means of production, while under fascism the goal is complete control. So maybe we like, because I think some people try to say that Hitler like privatized a lot of industry, but it's like, yeah, he might have like given it to specific people or sort of given up the state ownership, but basically the state control was on such a level that basically you couldn't even consider it a private ownership because
and
of,
you know what
yeah.
the means were? Keeping out competition, giving that company special privileges on the one hand, and two, taking over their labor laws, their wages and labor regulate. So in effect, the governments of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's fascist Italy took effective control over companies while leaving the private title to that company. I mean, what if the government can tell you what to do with your property? Is it really private property, even if you still have the deed? But that's in effect what the fascist economic model has. It'll keep these private owners, let them have the deed to the company, but then they'll have surrounding economic regulations that in effect keep out competition. Huh, does that sound familiar? Regulate the labor conditions and wages of the place. Huh, does that sound familiar? That is exactly the direction that America is moving in, where by means of economic regulation, the government is really controlling business. And this marriage of government and the economy is exactly what socialism is. I mean, remember, Nazism is National Socialism. It was a worker socialism, said Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler said Nazism means worker socialism. Now, does that mean the outright ownership, the titular ownership to all the means of production? That's communism, where they take the title away and it's just one government. Okay, they're a little more honest in that sense. But if I take away your control of the property, I've in effect taken ownership, effective ownership. Whoever keeps the deed to the property, that is that is superficial, absolutely superficial. But the economic model of fascism, 100 years ago, 90 years ago, was just exactly that: strict government regulation and control over the businesses, while leaving this title to the property in the hands of most businesses, not all, by the way, but most businesses. And by means of what? Labor regulations, competition regulations, things of that nature, just like we're seeing in America today. And
Yeah,
so,
and
yeah.
yeah, just to bring up a bit more, when it comes to even sort of when Trump tries to hide behind the national security issue, again, I've said this many times, if it truly is, and I think you could make the case that the American government, specifically the American military, needs to make sure that it can get sort of like supplies or sort of some manufacturing if it is at war with certain nations. I think you could make the case for it. And I think that can be solved easily. Simply give out the government contract for like 5, 10, 15 years, basically saying, we will buy this amount of steel for this amount of time, but only produce domestically. And then if a company wants to decide that they want to do this, they will do so. And if not, then raise the price. Again, I think it's okay for a government to basically give out like a basically public contract, basically saying, we think we need this for national security reasons. It's not okay for the government to come in and try to control private companies through tariffs or through direct ownership, through regulations, through anything else. I think the only way to really do so properly is to have this sort of like an open
Look,
competition.
what does the military need? The military needs, well, to feed its soldiers, to put uniforms on its soldiers, to buy steel, to buy computer chips. Yeah, there is no product under the sun where they couldn't justify through national security the socializing of that industry, right? Everything from pillowcases to food to television sets to computer chips and steel. It is absolutely absurd to worry about national security if we're buying if a Japanese company like Nippon is buying U.S. steel, that is not a threat to U.S. national security. And if it really is a problem, if our chips are being made by Taiwan, well, Taiwan is not our enemy. Of course, we're afraid that China will attack Taiwan, take over Taiwan, and how will that disrupt? And they'll make the same argument about pharmaceuticals, which we actually do buy from mainland China. But the point, though, is that if we have that problem ourselves, it's because we've priced ourselves out of the market through labor regulations, the welfare state, and other things, as I say. It is true that if a country is the sole supplier of that, that by itself is not a national security threat in my mind. By itself, so long as that's an allied country, and look, if some dictatorship invades them and we have close economic relations with them, we'll defend the country. I mean, I don't understand the national security issue. Like you say, a contract is one thing, and protecting yourself with long-term contracts is one thing. But what we do is, and it could be that America is naturally turning into a service economy, that we're artificially trying to keep through tariffs, say, our industries, our heavy industries alive. But part of the problem, another part of the problem, is the fact that through our welfare state, our labor laws, our minimum wage laws, our occupational safety laws, we make it very expensive for companies, more expensive in the United States to open up a factory than of any kind than it is to open up a factory in most other countries in the world. And instead of dealing with the real cause of the problem, government regulations coming from the federal government, which make it cost prohibitive to manufacture stuff in the United States, instead of getting rid of those regulations, which would be the capitalist solution, he just layers on another bunch of subsidies and regulations and totally an uncapitalistic response to the issue, even assuming that there's a national security component to the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, again, we are not getting again, like I say, government can give out. I think it would be okay for in a free market for government to like give out because government like it needs to buy things from a free market. Like even the military stuff has to be bought on a free market, right? So I think it could give or sort of give out this public sort of asks or basically a competition for any private company to possibly try to make. But yeah, maybe if America was actually a free market system, it wouldn't even have to do because a
We
lot
wouldn't
of
have to do it.
yeah,
But it could say we'll only buy certain products from an American company that does it, and that government contract will give the business to that domestic company. I have no problem with that. If the government really needs it for national security, I don't see any problem with having a contract, a long-term contract with a domestic maker of that. No, that wouldn't be a problem. But they wouldn't take over the whole darn industry,
yeah.
like
Not to mention
computer
for
chips.
not to mention government cannot produce. So even if it like
Should
those
not.
things don't even solve the thing. Tariffs or government ownership of the industry doesn't even solve your issue
Doesn't
because
solve the
they
problem.
fundamentally cannot produce on
No,
that
it's just
level.
a layer. It's just a layering of more government, more socialism, more fascism, depending on whatever the terminology you want to use. More government involvement in the economy is always the proposed solution to a government-created problem in the first place. And this we're seeing play out exactly. And Mr. Trump, by doing this and by signaling that Intel may not be alone, we don't even have the excuse of the 2008 financial crisis, mind you. That was an insufficient excuse, in my view. People say, whoa, you can't let
Well,
these big
Trump
multinational.
declared national emergencies,
Right, all you have
James,
to do
don't
is declare a
forget.
national emergency. Well, it isn't even the 2008 economic crisis. He might get us into an economic crisis by keeping this up, but it won't be. But there's no such crisis here. And besides, I disagree with the idea back in 2008. They were saying too big to fail. I disagree with that altogether. I disagree with that completely. There can't be any such thing as too big to fail. There must be a complete separation between state and economics, just as we have a separation of church and state in the United States. All of these previous, before the 21st century, let me put it this way, there were a few examples of this, but they were all controversial. It seems now that we've entered the 21st century, government ownership of taking stake in publicly held private corporations is becoming now a norm and an accepted thing, and so much for capitalism. Trump is no advocate of the free market. He is one step different than Mr. Mondami that he complains about as being a Marxist.
We have a super chat from Gail, thank you so much, and a super chat from Ginger, thank you so much. And with that, we've dealt with the economic fascism. Let's deal with economic social or sort of social fascism, I guess. And it's specifically the recent executive order by Trump, where I mean, I can quote specific the section 2C of the executive order saying, to the maximum extent permitted by the Constitution, the Attorney General shall vigorously prosecute those who violate our laws in the ways that involve desecrating the American flag and may pursue litigation to clarify the scope of the First Amendment exceptions in this area. Basically, again, I love the wording. To the extent of the Constitution possible, do something that is unconstitutional or sort of is protected by the Constitution. So
The Supreme Court has spoken on this, and more than once. I believe the landmark case here is a 1989 case, and if memory serves, it's Texas versus Johnson, a 1989 U.S. Supreme Court case. If you want to look it up, Texas versus Johnson. If I burn a flag to communicate, that is protected speech. If I burn my own flag on my own property in a safe way, that is perfectly protected constitutionally. He knows this. And what he's doing is he's trying to push the envelope. He's trying to create a constitutional case that he thinks might alter this. He's also misusing the concept of incitement. He says burning a flag, what he said when he signed the order is burning a flag incites riots. No, generally speaking, while is plenty of flag burning during riots, it's part of the riot. The riot was caused by something else, say supporters of Hamas, as we saw when the universities had those demonstrations and they were putting Hamas flags around statues and burning US and Israeli flags. Yeah, it's part of a riot. It's the burning of the US flag or the Israeli flag was not what incited the riot. The riot was against US policy supporting Israel on college campuses. So they'd burn US flags as part of that. But the Supreme Court, now, obviously, if I'm creating a public hazard by doing an arson, if I'm burning something in a dangerous way, that's arson. If I'm burning something on a public street, that could be a crime because you can't just set fires on a public street insofar as it's arson. But what if I'm not engaged in arson? What if it is my flag? What if I'm just trying to communicate? What if I'm taking plenty of safety precautions? It is perfectly protected communicative action. And that is protected by the First Amendment and free speech. And the Supreme Court has spoken on that. Obviously, if it risks physical danger to other people, like arson does, and we already have incitement laws, but incitement laws means that the action has to then and there directly inspire the violence, the public violence. I can't for the life of me. Well, I can think of since the Vietnam War, even before the Vietnam War, I can think of a dozen different the BLM riots back in 2020. Again, I can think of more than one case during my lifetime in which US flags were burned, but it wasn't the burning of the flag that incited the riot. The burning of the flag was part of the riot. And so Mr. Trump has conceptually confused the very term incitement. Unless you really believe that ordinary law-abiding patriotic Americans will get so upset that I would need evidence for that. I would need them to be incited then and there, imminently. Otherwise, it doesn't come within the incitement statute, which is, part of free speech. Free speech does not allow you to do violence, nor, like solicit murder. I'm saying, you kill the guy for $1,000. That's not free speech. If I offer you $1 million to commit murder, no, because it's part of a crime of violence that would violate someone else's rights. The same analogy would apply here. If the arson is not endangering anybody, or if the burning is not endangering anybody and therefore amounts to arson, it's protected speech. You can't burn someone else's flag. That would be vandalism of your property. But if it's my flag, I'm doing it in a safe way, it is protected speech. And you can't distort the concept of incitement to riot or the use of flag burning during riots to claim that it is incitement, because I can't think of a riot that was ever, a major riot that was ever incited by burning a U.S. flag.
Yeah, I think what you've earlier said about Trump being conceptually confused, I think that's my new nickname for him, because it very much does fit. But yeah, absolutely. Again, this is another example of, because everything that could be sort of connected with burning a flag is already covered under everything else. If you burn somebody else's flag, that's a different law. If you burn it on somebody else's property, as I think right when this executive order was actually put into place, a bulwark, I think journalist or a writer has burned a flag in somewhere close to the White House on a park, and he was arrested. But he was arrested because he was burning something on a sort of
You can't burn
public property.
anything in a park in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So,
Right.
Again, every single thing you could, every single example of where burning a flag is either a violation of individual rights or a violation of law is already covered somewhere else. This goal is specifically to again use the arm of government to either, as you mentioned with the riots, specifically try to maybe even go after. Now, I'm not sure if you are allowed to burn things at a sort of even like scheduled protest, but if you are, that's again sort of another goal of the creeping fascism, of basically
No,
Trump
right.
wanting to expand
There are
his
places,
yeah.
there are public parks where burning a fire, a campfire, or having a barbecue are perfectly legal. And so in those contexts, if I'm doing no more than say, no greater danger than having a campfire where campfires are allowed, how are you going to come in and say, well, you can't use a flag as part of your fuel, even in a symbolic gesture? No. If the fire is legal there, even on public property, burning my flag on that property is still legal and protected. You see the distinction?
Yeah, so absolutely. We are running out of time, so we didn't have time to
Well, that's too
cover
bad
everything.
because Trump's creeping fascism is all over the place. Washington D.C. is under federal jurisdiction, but to send National Guard troops into other places like Chicago or L.A. or New York or Baltimore, where there is crime, just to get a handle on crime would be a violation of federalism. The government has no, most of the federal criminal statutes are justified by this absurd interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Most federal drug laws, most the federal kidnapping laws, bank robbery laws, all of them, in my view, are a grotesque distortion of the Commerce Clause. But most federal criminal statutes are justified under this ridiculous understanding of the Commerce Clause that's only existed within the last 100 years. Most federal criminal statutes are, in my view, unconstitutional. But even here, we don't need any new constitutional law. The government has no business. The federal government has no business sending in federally controlled National Guard troops, even if they're the state militia, to control crime. Was a prosecutor. I hate crime, but if Trump tries to do this outside of Washington D.C., I think he's facing serious constitutional problems. But again, we see creeping fascism.
Yeah, and we'll most likely try to cover it more, especially with the way Trump is going. And James, if you are not able to burn a flag, then I might do that for you if you so
Well, that's the
will
thing.
need
I
to
don't
meet
want
with
to
the
offend people, and I cherish the U.S. flag. It's sacred to me. When President Obama said that burning a Quran is un-American, no, free speech is what's American, Mr. Obama. I thought to myself, I wouldn't normally burn a Quran, but if you're going to say that, you're going to get me out there burning a Quran. I'd burn a Bible. Now, those things I'm not wedded to in a value way. I am wedded to the U.S. flag in a value way. I cherish the symbol. But if someone were to make it a crime in itself to burn the flag, you'd make me go out of my way to burn a flag, put me in jail, and I'll take the test case to the Supreme Court, put me in jail. But please don't make me burn a symbol I cherish. But when you do that, when you threaten a law, you make me want to go out and violate that law on purpose.
Well, as I've said, we might continue covering this, especially if anything moves in a certain direction. We still have one more show today that people can watch. We'll talk about how Qatar wants more hostage taking. Now, again, Qatar, the major US ally and the one negotiating for the release of those hostages. So, link to that is in the chat. So, make sure to join us for that. Thank you, James, for joining me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and bye bye.
Be safe.